address the Dutch audience. So I will be speaking in Dutch to them for just a minute to introduce you a little bit, and then I'll turn to you, and then we'll have our talk.
I'll do my best.
Okay, great. Okay, here we go. Goedendag mensen, bedankt voor het kijken naar deze podcast. Nieuwe aflevering vandaag. Weer met een Amerikaanse prolifer. Dit keer Kiki Latimer. Zij is gestudeerd psychologe en filosofe. Ze schreef onder meer dit boek van Steven Schwartz en haarzelf. En ik ga het vandaag met haar hebben over een beetje de pro-choice en pro-life argumenten die er zijn en wat we daarvan kunnen leren vanuit Amerika, maar ook misschien vanuit de situatie in Nederland. Dus ik ga snel verder met dit gesprek. So, welcome, Ms Latimer.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. I've just introduced you a little bit to the Dutch audience, but you could do a better job of that, of course, yourself. So if you could shortly introduce yourself, tell us what you do in your daily life.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm a mother of 4 grown children and 12 grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
In the last, not presently because of COVID, but in the past 6 years, I've worked at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, both teaching and co-teaching homiletics, which is teaching seminarians and priests how to give a homily.
Mm-hmm.
So my background is philosophy, speech communication, and I just recently received a master's in moral theology through Holy Apostles. I've worked with Steven Schwartz, the primary author of the abortion book, oh goodness, for the last 40 years, I guess it's been. I was his student, then his TA, and now I've worked with him on several books.
I see. And I understand you also write children's books.
I do. I have 4 children's books.
Right.
Them about missionary work that I've helped with in Haiti.
Oh, I see. Okay, interesting. If you want, I can give them the website later on to that, for instance, to see if people are interested in that as well. I'm sure they are. But let's get into the reason I wanted to ask you, because let me first introduce the situation a little bit. Probably like 5 or 6 years ago, when I started to become serious about the pro-life issue, and I told myself I want to be part of the Dutch abortion debate, I think I was listening to Scott Klusendorf, and he actually talked about this book, Understanding Abortion. And he talked about it in such a way that I thought, I think there's lots of rational thinking in that book, and I can really use that for the debate, because I think in a lot of places in the world, the rationality of it, philosophy is sort of missing in the debate. And it really appealed to me when I read it. I actually bought it twice. I bought one hard copy and one for digital purposes, so that I could make notes easier. So that's how important the book was to me. And it helped me a lot to get started and actually still today to use a lot of its content, because it's so extensive. It's such it actually is very neutral, I believe. It gives the reader a lot of the pro-choice arguments, and it really makes a steel man argument for them, so that's a very positive thing, I believe. Now, let me get into my questions. How did you come into contact first with Steven Schwartz, and how did the idea come to actually write this book that you co-wrote?
Well, as I said, in 1980, I was his student in a philosophy class. I was, at the time, what I would call pro-choice by default, part of the culture. We had a several weeks discussion in this ethics class about abortion, during which I became very pro-life. Mm-hmm. But it was at that time, shortly after that, he wrote a book called The Moral Question of Abortion. Mm-hmm. And that book was written from a very religious point of view, and it was completely pro-life.
Yeah.
But then years later, I started to be his teaching assistant, and we started actually sort of teaching this topic of abortion in class together. And I guess about 10 years now ago, he was asked to rewrite or revamp that Moral Question of Abortion book for republication. It was out of publication. Right. And we went back to that book And basically I said to him, this is not the book you would write today. After seeing the success of teaching it from a very neutral standpoint, I said, you would write a different book today. I said, both of us would probably write the book the way we now teach it in the classroom. Giving, the pro-life side, the pro-choice side, allowing the two sides to debate with each other, never giving our own point of view, but just the strongest arguments on each side, and letting the student come to their own rational understanding of which side of the debate was correct.
Right.
So
And would you say, sorry, would you say that your own road to pro-life was sort of a blueprint for that, because you
Yeah.
understood how people thought who were on that side?
Yes, to some extent. Yeah.
Okay.
Although I learned more as I went along.
Right. Okay.
So we wrote the book from a completely different standpoint, and as you say, that's the book that this became what we did in the classroom as best we could.
Right.
In writing. Obviously, the classroom is a whole different form of education, but we did our best to put it into book form.
Exactly. Okay. Well, like I said, there are a lot of pro-choice arguments in the book, and you do your best to represent them honestly. So what would you say is a typical pro-choice argument that just the random pro-lifer, maybe also a default pro-lifer, could struggle with if they come across it? What would be the top one that's out there?
Well, the arguments fall basically into to two primary categories. One says it's simply not a person. The being in the womb is not a person. It's on its way to becoming a person. It's a potential person. At worst, it's a blob of cells. At best, it's a potential person. But it's simply not a person, and therefore the personhood of the woman takes precedence over this blob of some kind of being in the womb that's simply not a person.
Right.
So that's the one primary camp of the pro-choice arguments. The other camp is the more blatant camp that I think is becoming stronger now, and that's the camp that says, yeah, it is a person, but so what? It's a person, but it doesn't count because it really doesn't have a say. The woman is her own being. This person has arrived in an unwanted place inside of her body, has no right to be there, has no right to protection because it's, not wanted there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so abortion is fine because her personhood takes precedence over this other person's life.
Right. I was actually last week. I was talking to Steve Jacobs from Chicago. He has a law degree, and he's also done a study on human development, for which he got a PhD. And he actually provided us with this consensus among biologists that life does start at conception, and that there's really no debate there that they are human. And so we talked with him. I talked about that the top layer of pro-choice, so the philosophers and the academics, they, like you say, they do acknowledge that it is a human being, and sometimes even that it's a person, but that it still doesn't mean that it deserves the right to continuation of life. But what he said was that the masses, according to his research, also they don't really know about that. They actually believe more in the part that says it's not even a human being; it's a blob of tissue. So it's interesting that you would say that it's starting to shift more to the academic layer. So their influence is becoming more visible. You might say, is that something that you're seeing around you?
I believe so. In 1973, here in the United States, our Roe v. Wade, the big abortion decision by the Supreme Court, that was the first time that the concept of human being and human person had ever been separated.
Right.
Before that, it was always assumed if you were a human being, you were a human person. If you had a human DNA, you were a human person. those concepts had never been separated before. And somehow that separation occurred so
Right.
that you could have something that had human DNA, human was even could be called a human being, but was not necessarily a person, was not
Right.
necessarily a human person.
And
And
you,
somehow that concept was bought by
yeah,
the general public and around the world, this
right.
separation.
Exactly. And you actually write about that, you and Stephen Schwartz, extensively in your book on how philosophers worldwide have started to shift, or at least, separate those two. Um, I've read that, and I thought it was very fascinating because they say, it's you have to have certain qualities to become a person. You have to have certain brain waves. You have to be self-conscious is also a big one. So what would you say are the most important differences between a human and a person according to these philosophers?
Well, the human being is simply a physical existence. Um, Basically, the concept that a human being, until it has consciousness, has the desire to continue in existence, has the ability to communicate, the human being is basically just like what our concept, our modern day concept of a zombie. So
Right.
the child in the womb is a zombie. It has movement. It has the ability to grow. It has organs and functioning. It has brain waves. It has some ability somehow to feel pain, even possibly,
Hmm.
but it's basically a zombie.
Right.
It's
Okay.
nobody home.
Right.
It's a very creepy thought. People don't like to put it in those terms, but it's actually a very creepy thought.
It's creepy, and it's dehumanization of a human being, of somebody who's clearly biology. In biology, you would say it's part of they are part of the human race, if you will. And to dehumanize that, you have to make a separation. Indeed, I would guess. But what would our pro-life answer be to that distinction between human and person?
Well, first of all, we simply take a look at states of ourselves when we don't have those abilities. When we're in a deep sleep, we do not have the ability to communicate.
Right.
We do not have the ability necessarily to even think about that we want to wake up in the morning. We simply don't have it. We don't have it when we're in a coma. We don't have it when we're under anesthesia. So there's times when the adult person doesn't have these requirements to be a person. But of course, no one would say that they cease to be a person when they go in for surgery.
Right.
That's it. But then there's the other thing is that the preborn child isn't supposed to have those qualities.
Right.
Again, it would be rather odd if the unborn child had the ability to start yelling through the womb what its thoughts and desires are. It's a natural, normal state to
Yeah.
not have those abilities at certain times in our existence. The other is our dependency obviously changes from when we're in the womb to our normal life, and then as we get older we have more dependency on people.
Right.
So if your existence depends on your ability to communicate, for instance, how much does a born baby communicate? Does a born baby does it think about wanting to exist tomorrow? Uh,
Hmm.
Most of those things that, for instance, Marianne Warren suggests are important for belonging in the human community don't exist for quite a while, even after birth. And sometimes as we get older and go into dementia and other difficult states as we get older, they don't exist then either.
Yep.
So at some point we're saying, the idea becomes then that you could be at some point, you're a potential person, then you're a quarter of a person, then you're half a person, then you're three-quarters of a person, and at some point you achieve personhood.
Right.
Question becomes then, well, what is half a person?
Right.
And physically, that's an impossibility. You either are or are not a person. Um,
Right.
these categories become very arbitrary as to their levels, but they also become arbitrary as to who makes the list.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
how many things, and let's say there's 6 things on the list. Well, I'm a person if I achieve 4 of them or 5 of them. What if I get all 6 of them but lose one of them? I have a stroke and I lose the ability to communicate. Am
Yeah.
I less of a person? Or am I not a person at all then? So
Yeah.
somebody makes the list, somebody decides, somebody in a position of power decides whether you are a person or not.
Right, and that makes it very creepy and very dangerous for even for born people to live under such rules or such in a culture that thinks that way. Actually, Steve Jacobs, who I talked to earlier, like I said, he mentioned that it's interesting how non-humans are sometimes looked upon as persons, or there are attempts, he said, to, for instance, there was an attempt to register or get recognition for a river to become a person by some environmental activists, I believe. In Argentina, I believe there was a gorilla. No, it was an orangutan. It was actually recognized as a person as well. So it's very strange how that could include more people than humans, but then for the unborn who are clearly humans, it's not. It somehow doesn't apply to them. It's very, very arbitrary indeed.
Your average adult chimpanzee or orangutan communicates much better than a 3-week-old baby, human
Right.
baby. You know,
Exactly. So it's very inconsistent, and that seems to be a problem with the pro-choice side, I believe, because consistency, it's almost as if they've just separated themselves from having to have consistency or even logic. It's all about feelings and just shifting your policies as you see fit somehow. But what you just mentioned Mary Ann Warren, and that's one of the things I loved about the book is that you actually mentioned the people who first started to make popular these philosophies back in the 70s, often, which a lot of people don't know today, that it's come that long, such a long way. One that I always tell people about is Judith Jarvis Thompson, who is one of the proponents. She was of the no duty to sustain argument, if I'm not mistaken, and she basically, I think she was the one who came up with the famous violinist analogy. Am I right?
correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems to me that a lot of Western abortion laws were kind of built upon that idea that yes, it's a human being, just like a famous violinist might be a full human being with every right to live, but it is also, once it is attached to you and dependent on your body for survival, it's also somebody who is allowed to be killed. Could you explain a little bit about the idea behind this way of thinking? How did they come up with it? Because it seems like they needed to have such an argument because the arguments about it's not a human are just failing because embryology was so far ahead of that question. They were basically going nowhere with that. Am I right?
Correct. Well, Judith Jarvis Thompson, you have to give her credit. Her article is actually, from what I understand, the most reprinted pro-choice article of all times.
Okay.
And I think it was because the science was starting to show that the idea that it's not a person, it's not human, it's a blob of cells was failing. And
Right.
so she was kind of ahead of time, realizing we got to get rid of that idea and just bite the bullet. It's a person, so what?
Yeah.
Um, and she does. And she has this idea that, you wake up, this analogy that you wake up, you or I wake up one morning and we are in a hospital suddenly attached to not just any old violinist, but actually a famous one or someone that the world actually cares about.
Yeah.
And this person requires your sustenance for the next 9 months. And you don't like it. You don't like it. He's attached to your body. He's using your kidneys, your heart to live. And it's like you have a life, like you have a job, you have things to do, you have plans, and like disconnect the guy,
Hmm.
get out of there. And the fact that he dies, she even acknowledges is sad. Um, she does acknowledge in the end that, if he's only got a couple weeks to go and you leave him to die to run off on a vacation, she calls that indecent. So if you just got a couple weeks to go, you probably should hang in there with the violinist. But if you're looking at 9 months or 6 months or 3 months, forget it. If you have an important life to lead, important places to go, disconnect it and get out.
Right.
And it seems like a very logical argument until you start to sort of pick it apart. It's got to do with the intimacy of your own body, the intimacy of your own privacy, your space. But if you look at that in a bigger picture of, let's say, your home. So I march into your home uninvited, invited or uninvited. I march in invited, and you change your mind after a day or two. I'm in your home. You've invited me to stay for a few months. But after a week of Kiki in your home, you've decided you really had it with me and you want to throw me out. Get out. It's your house. Well, maybe you could do that if it's relatively warm outside. It's 30 degrees below zero and you're throwing me out of your house means my death. Then it becomes very questionable. Do you have the human right to throw me out?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Interesting.
can you throw me out becomes questionable. So that's even if I'm invited in, if I march in on my own, again, it's questionable. Can you throw somebody out of your home if they're going to freeze to death outside? Or are you, as a decent human being, and when you look at human rights, you have to put up with me for a while. But let's look at what abortion is. Abortion is not just taking the baby out. Abortion is the equivalent of you saying, I don't like you in my house anymore, and you kill me. And
Proactive.
then
Then you throw it out.
body out the door. Abortion is a direct killing because you don't like me in your house. And that becomes even more morally questionable than just removing me from the house. Now, there are certainly ethical situations like the life of the mother where you can morally take the baby out. You can say, we're going to take you out of the house. We're going to do everything we can once you're out of my house to save the mother and the baby. Sometimes we can foresee, but not intend, that the baby won't make it. But there are plenty of times where you can take the baby out, doing everything possible to save both mother and baby. And that's acceptable under extreme circumstances, especially of life of the mother. There's plenty of circumstances with life of the mother where you hang on to that pregnancy as long as you possibly can, and then you can remove the baby, head for the incubator, do everything you can to save both. And I've certainly seen many instances where it's perfectly acceptable to remove the baby. In an ectopic pregnancy, where there's no chance of the baby making it, and the baby stays in there, mom's going to die as well. So you take the baby out, and you don't intend the death of the baby. You would still, even then, wish that you had all of the equipment to save that little being, but you don't. So again, there are times when if I have a contagious disease and I'm in your house and you've invited me in, you realize I have, COVID-19 and a really bad case of it, and you have to get me out of your house. Let's say you have a lung condition. So if you get COVID, you're going to die. So you got to get me out. So, you call the ambulance to come and get me, so that when you take me out of the house, you do everything possible to save both your life and mine. There are times when that's absolutely morally acceptable. That's radically different than I have, a disease in your house, so you chop me into small pieces and, bury me in the basement or throw me out the door.
Right.
So Judith Jarvis Thompson, while it's a charming article that seems very logical. It really isn't a good analogy for what abortion actually is.
Right. And also, you spoke about just kicking someone out of the house, but in this case, it's actually also her own child, her blood-related child, and that's another maybe a big difference with the analogies, with the analogy that she had. It just doesn't work somehow. Um, in the Netherlands, where I live, we have an abortion law that's sort of it looks like a compromise, but if you understand what the philosophy is of Judith Jarvis Thomson, who I hear from you is the most popular one or the most recited one, there certainly are similarities because the Dutch law says it is unborn life, which is has a lot of consequences, you might say, morally. It even says that the woman has a certain responsibility for that life and that the doctor should be aware, should make sure that she understands that responsibility. But then the other rule is that only in a state of emergency, in a case of emergency, she can do an abortion. But then after that, it says she's the only one who can actually determine what constitutes an emergency. So it's kind of I call it schizophrenic almost, the way the law was done, because you do acknowledge in it that it's a life, human life, obviously, but then the mother decides on that life. So would you agree that a lot of this is based on just the feeling of, in this case, the mother, and not biological facts and moral consequences based on that fact?
It's based on her feelings. It's very similar to what we have here, where we say you can get an abortion for the health and life of the mother.
Yeah.
And health includes her emotional health, which is her feelings. So if you wake up on the 8th month and you decide you have a bad feeling about this pregnancy, maybe your marriage is falling apart, maybe you're worried about finances, you can abort a perfectly healthy baby in the 8th, 9th month of pregnancy whenever you want, because you don't feel good about bringing this person, quote unquote, into the world. Of course, the baby is already in the world because your womb is in the world, but so this idea, but you're just simply going to get rid of it because you have bad feelings.
Right.
Yeah, bad feelings can be serious. I don't want to make light of bad feelings. Emotional situations can be extremely difficult.
Yes.
For some people. But whether those extremely bad feelings allow you to take the life of another person is what the question is here.
Yeah.
If I have a neighbor that makes my life miserable, I mean, really miserable, can I go over and shoot him? That's the question.
Yeah. That's basically what they're saying.
If I'm sick and tired of my grandmother and I think she's going to, she's mean to me, can I shoot her?
Right.
If somebody makes you miserable enough in your life, can you kill them?
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
That sort of reminds me because most people would not take it that far if they're pro-choice because they don't feel that even a late abortion is morally right often, and especially not after birth. But that does bring me to someone else mentioned in the book. That person is Michael Tooley. He is basically now, well, you might say that Peter Singer might be his successor almost in that regard. He was someone who, for the audience, said that I believe after 2 months after birth, you could still decide that this child is not wanted, its life is not wanted in your life, and you could, even though it's perfectly healthy, you could still have it euthanized after 2 months because basically he says it's not, it doesn't have self-consciousness, it doesn't have the feelings of I want to live and stuff like that. Would you say that is the more consistent pro-choice approach, more consistent than those people who are talking about feelings and who are saying that after, let's say, 24 weeks, it pops into existence as a human being? Is that a more consistent way, the way Michael Tooley speaks about it?
I actually love Michael Tooley and Peter Singer because they're brilliantly, on some level, consistent.
Right.
They recognize that, you coming through the birth canal did not make you a person. If you weren't a person 2 minutes before your mother gave birth to you, you sure as heck ain't a person 2 seconds after giving birth. they recognize that the concept behind Roe v. Wade and other pro-choice arguments are just absurd.
Right.
If you're a person, you're certainly not a person because somebody moved you through the birth canal or pulled you out of the womb through a C-section. So they recognize that that just doesn't make any sense. So they do have a criteria for personhood, not one that I agree with, but they have a criteria, and they are consistent with that criteria. You're not a person before birth, you're not a person after birth. You know, at some point you fill in the Marianne Warren criteria, you can communicate, or you start to, as a baby, interact, you start to show the world that you're there, that you have wants and desires. So, you know, they've ranged anywhere from, 2 months to 6 months with this concept, but at least it is consistent.
It is consistent. And are they, through that philosophy, are they taking us back to pre-Christian times, you would say, where children who were still young were not considered persons? They were non-persons in a way and possession of the parents?
Possibly. You know, it's very interesting with Peter Singer. He held consistently the same view at end-of-life issues with euthanasia. It was like once mom or grandma, hits dementia and doesn't contribute to society and, doesn't really communicate well anymore. It's like, get rid of grandma. The interesting thing was, and I always have to think about a philosophy that you can't live. How good is a philosophy that you can't live? And Peter Singer's mother, some years back, became ill and started, I believe, to go into dementia, but she was very ill. His philosophy said he should pull the plug, but he couldn't.
No.
He was unable to do that.
Right.
And he considered that a weakness on his part. I would call it the strength of love.
Right.
But he realized at that point, it was very interesting that his philosophy was, at least for himself, was not livable.
But why was it weak? Was he letting society down, or himself, or his mother?
I think he felt that he was allowing his feelings to rule the day.
Right.
And that was weakness. His intellect told him we should pull the plug on mom, but his feelings of love said no.
I wonder what it would benefit to pull the plug, because he's clearly a proponent of that action. But would it benefit? Is it for society that he's making that choice?
I believe that a lot of it has to do with, for society, that she's no longer a contributing member.
Exactly. Okay.
Society. It would also have to have behind it some concept that there's no value in human suffering. Very often you hear, for Down syndrome babies, for people at the other end of life, there's the concept that, we shoot horses, don't we? I believe was the name of the book years ago. There's no point in human suffering, so human suffering has no value to it. And that's certainly a pre-Christian concept, because as Christians, we do believe that obviously Christ's suffering changed the value of suffering. Suffering we can learn, that through times in life we learn sometimes our best lessons.
Right.
And
in this case, Right. Well, and in this case, it's also him saying you can kill someone who can't decide for themselves. It's one thing if you allow people to decide for themselves that their suffering is unbearable, or without hope, etc. There's actually, in the Netherlands now, they're talking about changing the law again for euthanasia on children, because now you can do it up to 1 year old. To 1 year old, they can euthanize them as doctors if they feel the pain is insufferable. But from 1 to 12, it's not allowed here. But 1 to 12, you're also not, as they say, competent to in a legal sense, make up your mind. And that's actually why it's still forbidden. But they want to actually expand it now to make sure that also 1 through 12, those people can now also be euthanized if there's, if there's too much pain or no hope for getting better. This is a very strange topic because, you might say it's about just a few cases a year, severe cases, but then what could we use it for more? And people are indeed, as you just mentioned, people are now talking about what would that mean for other people who are not capable of making their own decisions, like senior citizens who have become demented, for instance, or senile. Yeah. So
It's
my next,
physical suffering, but then you have to
yeah.
say, well, what level of physical suffering can I put you out of your misery? And then very quickly we've seen added to it emotional suffering. And so what level of emotional suffering do you have to have for me to put you out of your misery? And involved in all of this is, it's easier to put you out of your misery. It's easier for me to put you out of your misery than try to help you with your misery. It is costly to help you with your misery. And so all it comes down to, we really can't afford to help 8-year-old Susie. We've spent too much money on her already, or grandma's sucking up the fun. So it becomes convenient. Might be difficult, but still convenient financially and long-term emotionally for us to just put you out of your misery before your misery becomes my misery.
Exactly. That actually reminds me of a documentary they had in the Netherlands about 5 years ago, I believe. There was a documentary in which I think 5 people were followed who had a euthanasia wish, and you could get euthanasia in the Netherlands. You have to go through a process, through a clinic, as they call it again in that case. And they actually followed all these people up to the moment of death, and they actually showed the death in some of these cases. It was very, very brutal to see. And one of these people was a very old woman. She was 101, I believe. And her tragedy, she said herself, was that her mind was perfectly intact, but her body was really letting her down. She needed constant help in the home that she was in, a nursery home. She had some pains, but it wasn't really insufferable. She just couldn't do much anymore. But throughout the interviews, she actually also said, I'm also very, very lonely. And then, she got her approval. She could get the euthanasia. And then they asked her, what's your last wish? So they went to the beach because she wanted to see the sea again, one last time. And then, she got lots of attention that day. She came back, and they actually asked her, how do you feel about the whole situation? Tomorrow is the day you're going to die. And then she said, well, it's funny because I kept saying I want to die, and I was very sure, but not today. Today, I don't want to die. If every day was like this, in other words, she wouldn't want to die. But there was silence after that. I think there was a counselor there as well. Nobody stood up and said, well, we'll just have to make that effort now to keep you, to fill up your days with nice things and help you that way so that you don't want to die. But of course, nobody did that. So the next day, indeed, she went through with it, and then she died. It's a very strange thing where people are today with regards to that. Like you said, we're not willing to make that extra step or because it's costly in some way. Okay, my next question would be, I wrote it down because it was a long one. Pro-choicers often do not agree about fundamental things. I'm sure you agree. Like when life begins, they're very mixed about that. Pro-lifers, we really don't have that problem usually, or at least not on a fundamental level. But there is always that internal debate on what the best argument against abortion is. Myself, I'm very fond of Don Marquise's argument, Future Like Ours argument, which is actually also in your book. That's why I learned about it. What's your best argument against abortion, if there's one?
Say helping someone to see the reality of the child. That you were once in that same boat, and your own reality as a person, the preciousness of human life. That this certainly the idea of an unwanted pregnancy doesn't equal an unwanted baby. That's probably the biggest thing that we often hear of, is not bringing an unwanted child into the world. Many people think that an unwanted pregnancy equals an unwanted child, which just isn't the case.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think seeing the reality of the child, seeing that, there isn't a distinction between human being and human person. If you're a human being, you're a human person, because the alternative is you're a zombie, that there's a growing thing inside women that is not a person.
Right.
Is that you really want to hang on to that idea? And then at some point, a zombie becomes a person. Well, what's that process? That's never been scientifically found in any way. So I would say the reality that the child, the being in the womb is smaller, less developed. It's in a different environment. It has a higher degree of dependency. But none of those things make you a person or less of a person. Those are things all that change. Our size changes, our degree of dependency, our environment, and our level of development changes throughout our life,
Exactly.
from conception to death.
Right.
So trying to help people to realize that human life is this continuum, that
Mm.
it starts at conception, that your DNA is put together. You have a sperm that's going to live maybe 5 more days. You have an egg that lives only 24 hours. These two entities come together, and you suddenly have a being that could live 100 or 101 or more years. So you have a radical break at conception from things that are just about ready to die to, a century ahead
Um,
of it. Um,
yes.
a totally unique set of DNA, unrepeatable
Right.
ever again. Um, so you have this radical break at conception, and then after that radical break, there's development, there's increase in size. Eventually, there's a movement there's an environmental movement from the fallopian tube to the implantation in the womb, and eventually out into um, being born, but that movement doesn't change anything. And then, of course, the degree of dependency changes as we move along the continuum of human life. So I think helping people to see that continuum, that after conception, there is no other radical break. I mean, others, lines have been suggested like viability, when you can live outside the womb, but viability is merely a matter of technology. Babies are viable now that, 50 years ago would not have been, say, born at 20 weeks. Um, a baby that's born here in the United States or where you are in the Netherlands versus a baby that's born in the, some jungle in Africa is even today would have very little chance of living, say, at 30 weeks in utero. But here it would just be a piece of cake. So viability is a matter of technology. A quickening when the mother feels the baby, that's just a matter of how big the baby is or her personal ability to feel a baby move. So other lines have been suggested, but they're all relative and arbitrary, whereas conception is a radical break.
Exactly. Well, you just basically you mentioned now the SLED acronym. So just for the people at home, it's SLED, size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. And you just mentioned those. And I think that's one of the more popular takeaways from the book that I just that you wrote with Stephen Schwartz, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps people like Scott Klusendorf made that popular, and there was always you hear it going around everywhere. And I remember telling people like I think that Stephen Schwartz and Kiki Latimer came up with that, but they is
Steve.
that the true actually?
Yes, Steve came
Yeah.
up with that, and he came up with the sled. It's a nice, easy way for students to to remember it.
Yes.
And we've challenged for 40 years. He challenged students to come up with any other difference
Hmm.
besides, and we've never had anyone come up with another difference that was morally um, meaningful, that
Right.
had anything. No one's ever come up with anything else, the difference as you go along, besides those four things that are morally relevant. That's the word I want. There just isn't anything else that anyone has, like I said, in the 50 years he's been teaching, he's retired now, no one came up with another possibility.
And that's why it still works today, and it's a very powerful tool, I must say. I've actually translated it to Dutch so that people can use it here, and I'm trying to get it out there so that people will start doing that. So last question. It's the time goes real fast. Um, well, as you know, you are an American. We here in Europe, we're looking at the situation in America. We see that there has been a switch of presidency. What do you think? What kind of challenges might that bring for the pro-life, well, possibly the worldwide pro-life movement, for instance, in Africa?
Well, it's a difficult switch for the pro-life situation right now, but we have a habit of, at least in my whole household, of saying presidents come and go, but Supreme Court justices last forever.
They do. Yeah, true.
We have, from this last presidency, we have gotten two strong, I believe, pro-life Supreme Court justices. So we have a possibility of overturning Roe v. Wade.
Hmm.
This country. There used to be a lot of question, possibly, that if Roe v. Wade were ever overturned, then the question would go back to the states.
Yeah.
But that's less likely, just like the slavery issue didn't go back to the states. Once the black was declared that he or she had full personhood, it did not go back to the states. Why would it go back to the states? So that's what the pro-choicers here are the radical left is very worried about that. If the court does recognize in my lifetime, that'd be nice, that the preborn child is a person with full rights, then it will not go back to the states.
Hmm.
Right now, we're looking at a presidency that is pushing once again for full, abortion rights, what they call reproductive health around the world, and that we will help fund it and promote it, which is a sad situation, which will
Yes.
affect a lot of people's lives, sadly. So,
Yes.
um,
That's very
well,
sad, and it seems to be part of this because they're so interested in abortion in other countries that you could almost make the case that it's part of something that has to do with population control. We know that the philosophies of utilitarianism, they believe that the suffering indeed is very should be minimized, but also that one of the elements to get there is to have less people on the planet. So it might be part of that, but it's definitely very, very a scary time perhaps, but also, like you said, because of the Supreme Court, a hopeful time still. We can still hope, and we're certainly following that from Europe, that this decision is made overturned in the future, hopefully in our lifetime indeed. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time. It's been wonderful. You've given us many things to talk about with our own viewers. I will translate it to Dutch as well and put subtitles underneath. Well, it's been a wonderful time, and thanks for having me today.
thank you. It's been wonderful. Anytime you would like to chat, I'm around.
That's good to know. Likewise, and I hope you have a great day. And thank you very much again.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye bye.